Think about what happens when an entire law enforcement task force sits down together. FBI agents, county detectives, the people who have dedicated every waking hour to one case. And the purpose of the meeting isn't a breakthrough. It's a wellness check. Not on the victim, on themselves. That happened last week. A joint task force of FBI agents and Pima County Sheriff's Office detectives. The same team that has worked the Nancy Guthrie disappearance full-time since February. Gathered for a meeting that generated enormous anticipation. Sources close to the investigation described significant buzz beforehand. People expected a development, a lead, something. Instead, the meeting was a check-in. Are you okay? Do you need anything? Do you need support? 3.5 months into the disappearance of an 84-year-old woman from her own home. And the people tasked with finding her needed someone to ask if they were holding it together. Here's what that tells you. It tells you this case is brutal. It tells you the pressure is omnipresent, following these investigators home, into their families, into every conversation with someone who knows what they're working on. A retired FBI agent who spent years in task forces described what the Pima County Sheriff's deputies are going through right now as nothing short of insane. And it tells you something else, something harder to sit with. From the outside, this case looks frozen. It looks like nothing has moved since that first night. When the car was found at the bar, when it felt like the pieces were falling into place. Since then, one retired agent put it bluntly, it's been like crickets. But here's the question that keeps surfacing, the one no one wants to answer directly. Is the silence because there's nothing to find? Or is the silence because they're building something? Quietly, methodically, against one or more individuals. And they can't afford to let it slip, because those two versions of silence look identical from the outside, and only one of them ends with someone in handcuffs. Over 100 days have passed since Nancy Guthrie vanished from her home in Tucson, and in that time, something shifted. Not in the evidence, not in the investigation, at least not publicly. The shift happened in who's talking, who's listening, and who stopped communicating altogether. The Pima County Sheriff confirmed that he is no longer in direct communication with Nancy's family, with Savannah Guthrie. In the early days, he indicated that contact was happening. Now, he says the family is speaking exclusively with the FBI. Let that register. The lead local law enforcement official on one of the most high-profile missing persons cases in the country stepped back from communicating with the victim's daughter. Why? A retired FBI agent who has decades navigating exactly these dynamics offered a measured explanation. The family may have grown frustrated with information that didn't align with what they were hearing elsewhere. Two agencies, two streams of communication, two versions of the same updates. Sometimes one is a better fit than the other. And perhaps someone from the FBI's Victim Services Division, described as skilled, kind, and effective, stepped in and did such a strong job that the family chose to keep that channel open instead. Or maybe it's simpler than that. The sheriff of Pima County has been under public scrutiny. There's an active effort to remove him from office. Maybe the Guthries, or their security team, or their advisors decided he wasn't who they wanted on the other end of the line. We don't know which version is true. What we know is the result. The family is talking to the FBI, not the sheriff. And in a case where communication is already constrained, where investigators can't say what they know, where the family can't get what they need, the channel through which that limited information flows matters enormously. Here's the central question of this case at this moment, the one that everything else orbits. What is happening behind the silence? Before we go deeper, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Nancy's family needs to know how many people are still paying attention, because a lot of reporters have moved on. A lot of audiences have moved on. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because when this case breaks and investigators say they are closer, you need to be here. Let's talk about what that silence looks like from the inside. When you work a case like this, according to retired agents who have lived through it, the stress doesn't stay at the office. It follows you into your kitchen, into church, into conversations with strangers who recognize your face, feel entitled to your emotional bandwidth. One retired agent described walking out of church, holding her child's hand when someone approached, and, in front of the boy, said they'd assumed both she and her husband had been killed in an attack. Because apparently, when you carry a badge, people forget you're a person first. That pressure compounds. It affects families. It creates cascading failures in every part of your life outside the investigation. And the people on this task force, a small, tight group, are carrying the weight of a nation's attention while navigating a case that, by every visible metric, has offered them almost nothing to work with. The task force meetings that started daily have become weekly, the natural rhythm of any long-running investigation. People cycle in and out, not because of failure, but because of transfers, deployments, shift rotations. New eyes come in. They have to read every report, absorb every detail, catch up to a case that's been running at full intensity for over 100 days. And somewhere in that rotation, in that constant churn of fresh perspectives and accumulated exhaustion, lies the answer to whether this case is stalling or building. Before we talk about theories, you need to understand what this disappearance has done to the people left behind. Savannah Guthrie has been on the Today Show through all of this. She has continued to work on national television, while her mother remains missing. And if you watch closely, you've seen the moments that made headlines, the days she stepped away from the last half hour of the broadcast, the days she disappeared from the set entirely. Social media erupted every time. What does it mean? Is something happening with the case? People treated her absences like tea leaves, reading into every empty chair. Here's what it means, according to someone who has counseled hundreds of victims' families. Grief moves like a wave. It overtakes you when you least expect it. And when you're Savannah Guthrie, you have a choice in that moment. You either get up and walk away, or you sit there and fall apart on live television while millions of people watch. She's choosing to walk away. She's choosing to be strong for her children, her husband, her family. And every single time she does, someone screenshots her empty seat and turns it into speculation. Here's what you need to understand about the landscape around her. She has a security team. She has small children. And she is living through what a retired agent described as an unbelievably traumatic experience, the kind that produces untold grief, not the kind that eases with time, the kind that ambushes you, the kind where one moment you're functioning and the next moment the wave hits and the floor disappears. She is not just grieving. She is grieving without resolution, without answers, without knowing whether the person who took her mother might come for her family next. That's a qualitatively different kind of fear. It doesn't have an off switch. John Ramsey understands something about that particular space. His daughter, JonBenet, was killed in 1996, and he spent years under public suspicion while grieving a murdered child. When asked what advice he'd give the Guthrie family, the first thing out of his mouth was, "Scrutinize the police." He compared it to being in the hospital. You can't just lie there and trust that every nurse is doing the right thing. You have to fight for yourself. You have to be your own advocate. You have to push. A retired FBI agent heard that and disagreed, at least in the general case. If you're dealing with LAPT, Chicago PD, Miami, New York, departments that handle homicides constantly, you probably don't need to second-guess their process. Those departments have institutional muscle memory for this kind of investigation. But Ramsey's situation was different. His local department had never handled a homicide. The inexperience was the vulnerability. And there was a detail in that case, one detail, that the retired agent said you simply can't look away from once you see it. The amount demanded in the so-called ransom note was the exact figure of Ramsey's year-end bonus, an odd number, something like $70,000. Once that coincidence lands, it's impossible to unsee. Where does Pima County fall on that spectrum of competence and experience? That's a question the Guthrie family is navigating in real time. With their security team, with their advisors, and apparently now exclusively through the FBI. What every agent agrees on is this: families push. It's normal, it's expected, it's entirely human, and investigators accept it. They understand the grief that drives it. They take it on the chin, as one agent put it, because at the end of the day, they took an oath to be victim advocates. Nancy is the victim, and advocating for her means absorbing the frustration of everyone who loves her. Here's what most people don't understand about where this investigation stands right now. 3.5 months in, the task force meets regularly. FBI agents and Pima County detectives working the case full-time. And the retired agents who have been through investigations exactly like this one describe a rhythm that the public almost never sees. In the early days, those meetings happened daily, every morning, every evening. What do we have? Where are we? What's next? Then the cadence dropped to 3 times a week. Then once a week. That's not decline. That's recalibration. Different agents are running different veins of the investigation. Some are on surveillance. Some are working digital analysis. Some are building family trees. And they have to come together to share what they've found. The meeting last week, the one that generated all the buzz, was part of that cycle. Are you okay? Doesn't mean, are you emotionally fragile? It means, do you need additional resources? Do you need support from another department? Are you hitting a wall on your particular thread that someone else could help break through? And sometimes those check-ins surface something unexpected. While analysts were working on one angle, a connection appears on another. Something that was sitting on the back burner suddenly gets warm. Ideas get exchanged, assignments get shuffled, and the investigation moves, even when, from the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. That's the most important thing to hold on to right now. Remember that first night? The night the car turned up at the bar. The retired agent who's been following this case described her reaction. I was so excited. It's all coming together, and then silence. The kind of silence that stretches from days into weeks, into months. But that silence, and here's what haunts investigators, is consistent with 2 completely different scenarios. Scenario 1. The trail went cold. The evidence dried up. Every lead hit a dead end. And the task force is grinding through a case with no traction. Losing energy by the week. Sustained only by obligation. And the knowledge that somewhere a family is waiting for. Answers that may not exist. Scenario 2. They found exactly what they needed. And they are quietly, painstakingly, methodically building a case against one or more individuals. Because in federal investigations, you don't arrest when you can identify. You arrest when you can convict, and conviction requires an airtight evidentiary foundation that leaves no exit for a defense attorney to exploit. That takes time, that takes patience. That takes the kind of silence that makes the public assume nothing is happening. Here's what we know they have: digital analysis capabilities, forensic tools, access to every camera, every phone record, every banking transaction associated with this case. Here's what we don't know, what any of that has revealed. The retired agent was blunt about it. I haven't. I hope I'm absolutely wrong. But it seems like nothing went right. And then, in the same breath, I hope they have things. They're developing things. They're working through things. They're waiting on all kinds of stuff. That's what I hope for. That tension between what it looks like and what it might actually be is the defining feature of this case right now. And the people sense that tension. Today, the investigators are managing something the public rarely considers: natural attrition. An FBI agent gets transfer papers to Washington. Paperwork filed long before Nancy disappeared. A deputy rotates to the graveyard shift. A military reservist deploys for 3 months. These aren't dramatic exits. They're the ordinary mechanics of law enforcement careers colliding with an extraordinary case. Every departure means someone new has to read in. Every arrival means fresh eyes, which is valuable, but also ramp-up time, which is costly. And meanwhile, the pressure from the public never lets up. Investigators go home, and everyone is asking. People know what case they're working. The retired agent compared the atmosphere to what she experienced during 9/11. Working straight through for something like 120 days without a day off. Families suffering. Strangers approaching at inappropriate moments in front of children. Saying things no one should have to hear in public. That's the human cost of carrying a case like this, and it's compounding every week. Here's the question that keeps circling back. Is the silence of this investigation the sound of failure or the sound of patience? You want this to be explainable. You want Nancy Guthrie's disappearance to slot into a category you've seen before. A pattern with precedent. A motive that makes sense. A type of crime that has a type of perpetrator and a type of resolution. Let's test that. Let's take the theories that keep circulating and see if any of them survive contact with what we actually know. Here's the thing. The public keeps reaching for answers that feel familiar, and every single one of them breaks apart under scrutiny. The online scam theory. A story broke out of California that grabbed national attention. An elderly couple found dead in their home. Murder-suicide. And as friends began speaking publicly, the story underneath the story emerged. The woman had been defrauded by a scammer, impersonating the actor Tom Selleck. The contact started in a social media comments section, and slowly escalated into a full financial exploitation. The woman's family saw it happening. They intervened. They took away her credit cards. They took away her checks. They thought they'd handled the situation. She still found ways to send money. It's a devastating story. The kind of predatory behavior that a retired FBI agent who spent years answering public tip lines describes with barely contained fury. Part of the job, she explained, was sitting at a phone bank and taking calls from elderly people who had lost everything. Every few months, every agent took that shift. And the calls came in waves. People who'd been stripped of their savings by someone they never met. Someone who targeted their loneliness and their trust and their isolation. Predators go for the most vulnerable. That's universal. That's documented. So the question landed immediately. Could something like that be connected to Nancy Guthrie? The retired agent was direct. Probably not. The reasoning is straightforward. Exploiting someone through a screen is, and this is the agent's framing, like shooting fish in a barrel. It's low risk. It's anonymous. It doesn't require physical confrontation. A person running an online scam doesn't need to put on dark clothing and approach a porch in the middle of the night. The risk profiles are fundamentally mismatched. One is predatory manipulation. The other is something closer to a tactical operation. And more critically, by now, 3.5 months in, the digital footprint of an online scam would have surfaced. Messages, phone records, transaction histories, account transfers. The digital exhaust, the agent's exact phrase, would have led investigators somewhere definitive. It hasn't produced a public arrest. Either it produced nothing, or whatever it produced is being held close. If Nancy's story is affecting you, if you believe she deserves answers, share this video. Every person who learns her name makes it harder for whoever did this to stay invisible. The more eyes on this case, the fewer places there are to hide. The wrench attack theory. This one came from an expert speaking to Fox Digital, and it connects to a wave of home invasions, concentrated in California, where perpetrators break into a home, physically restrain the occupant, and force them to unlock bank accounts, crypto wallets, financial apps. The violence isn't the point. The access is. It's robbery redesigned for the digital age. The expert suggested this framework could explain what happened to Nancy, a mastermind behind the scenes. The motive, getting into her accounts through physical force. Now ask yourself, does that survive what we know? A retired FBI agent with decades of financial crime experience answered flatly, I think they would have had someone in handcuffs if that were the case. These operations leave traces. They require the victim to authenticate digital access, which means device logs, transaction records, bank security systems that flag unusual activity. 3.5 months is more than enough time to unravel that kind of scheme. If someone forced Nancy to unlock her accounts, that transaction has a timestamp, a destination, a trail. And then there's the quieter objection, the one that the retired agent raised almost gently. The premise assumes Nancy had substantial liquid assets accessible through digital platforms. She almost certainly didn't have cryptocurrency. The suggestion drew immediate skepticism. Given her generation, her background, everything about how she lived, the picture is of someone with a traditional conservative approach to money. The kind of person who keeps physical statements, who knows where every dollar sits. Nobody who knew her, nobody in her neighborhood, nobody close to the case has described any indication of financial distress. Her house had a new roof. The pool was maintained. That garden, one agent called it gorgeous. This was not a home in decline. These were not the circumstances of a woman drowning in debt or sitting on a crypto fortune worth raiding. There was brief speculation about whether Nancy had taken second mortgages on the property. That hasn't been verified by anyone close to the case. And given her relationship with Savannah, given the resources Savannah has access to, the idea that Nancy would have been left financially desperate doesn't hold together. So the scam theory collapses on the digital evidence that should exist, but apparently doesn't. The wrench attack theory collapses on both the digital trail and the financial profile, which means the answer is closer to home. And that's the part nobody wants to sit with. Here's what investigators have. Here's what they don't. They have a task force working full-time, FBI resources, digital forensics capabilities, access to phone records, financial records, camera footage from the neighborhood and beyond. They have analysts running data through systems that can cross-reference cell tower pings, financial transactions, and movement patterns across jurisdictions. They have a house that was processed thoroughly enough that law enforcement felt confident returning it to the family. Every room, every surface, every fiber, whatever they were going to find inside those walls, they found, or determined it wasn't there. They have the mat, that front door mat. The one a retired FBI agent has said repeatedly she would have seized immediately on the very first night is still sitting at the house. Law enforcement returned everything, except whatever they decided to keep. And the mat remains at the threshold. Whether that's an oversight, a deliberate choice, or evidence already processed and returned, is another question without an answer. Here's what they appear not to have, at least publicly: a named suspect, a declared person of interest, a definitive motive that has survived scrutiny, a body. Without physical remains, the case exists in a legal purgatory that every prosecutor dreads. You can build a murder case without a body. It's been done. But the evidentiary standard is punishing. Every gap, every missing piece, every unanswered question becomes a doorway for reasonable doubt. And defense attorneys are trained to walk straight through those doors, without a digital trail that leads somewhere definitive. And both retired agents who've weighed in suggest that the scam and financial attack theories should have produced one by now. The fundamental nature of the crime itself remains unclear. Was Nancy targeted for who she was, for what she knew, for what someone believed she had, for a reason nobody outside the task force has considered? The digital exhaust that would accompany a scam or a financial attack hasn't materialized into a public lead. Either the motive exists in a space that doesn't generate that kind of trail, or the trail exists, and the task force is sitting on it. And here's what changed in the physical landscape around the investigation. The HOA in Nancy's community has sent out multiple notices. They're asking people to stop visiting the house, to stop leaving flowers. Chains have been placed across the driveway. Additional no trespassing signs have gone up. The neighborhood that was once quiet after dark has become a destination for content creators, for the morbidly curious, for people who feel connected to a woman they never met. That critical question, the one this entire case pivots on: what is happening behind the silence? The investigation is active. The task force is meeting. The FBI is the primary point of contact with the family. But the public-facing information has dried to nothing. And if you're the Guthrie family, if you're Savannah, you're stuck between two impossible positions. You can push for information, which is normal and expected, and entirely human. Or you can trust the process, which requires believing that the silence is strategic and not stagnant. A retired agent who has been on the receiving end of that pressure from families described it simply: investigators take it on the chin. They accept the frustration. They understand the grief that drives it. Because when you spend decades in law enforcement, you're spending decades as a victim advocate. That's the oath. That's the purpose. And Nancy Guthrie is the victim they're advocating for, whether or not it looks like anything is happening from the outside. Now ask yourself what you would do. Your mother was taken from her home. Law enforcement has processed the scene and returned the property to your family. The investigation is ongoing, but the house is yours again. Do you sell it? Neighbors described it as immaculate. New roof, maintained pool. A garden that one retired agent called gorgeous. This wasn't a house in decline. There were no outward signs of a woman struggling financially. No deferred maintenance, no decay. The yard alone told a story of someone who cared about where she lived. And now it sits empty, chained off, posted with warnings, visited daily by strangers, who tried it as something between a memorial and a spectacle. A retired FBI agent's answer was immediate: keep it. Who cares what the HO people say? At least for a year. Because that's what grief counselors recommend. No major decisions for 12 months. And beyond the practical advice, there's something else. Going into your parents' home, even after something like this, means being in their presence, surrounded by the objects they chose, the spaces they shaped, the evidence of a life that mattered. The comparison to another famous case surfaced naturally. O.J. Simpson's house eventually had to be demolished entirely. Every brick was sold, and still, decades later, people seek out the location. C's home has become what the agent described as an iconic location. That's not sentiment. That's just the reality of a case that captured national attention. People are not going to stop visiting. The HOA can install chains and post signs and send as many notices as they want. But public fascination operates outside the jurisdiction of neighborhood governance. There is no law enforcement reason to prevent a sale. The property was turned back over. Whatever evidence that house contained has been collected, cataloged, and filed. All bets are off, as far as evidentiary needs, with one exception that nobody will address directly: the mat, that front door mat that a retired FBI agent has flagged from the very beginning. The one she says she would have collected as evidence on night one. It's apparently still there. Whether it's been processed and returned, whether it holds any remaining value, whether its continued presence at the house is meaningful or incidental, nobody will say. But it sits there, at the threshold of a home that a woman was taken from, and every person who visits sees it. The neighborhood itself has undergone a transformation that no one anticipated and no one asked for. A quiet community where nobody was around after dark has become a constant stream of outsiders, bloggers, streamers, journalists, and people who just feel compelled to stand where Nancy stood and try to understand what happened on the other side of that front door. The neighbors closest to Nancy, the ones who actually knew her, don't mind. They've told reporters the same thing, in different words, with the same feeling behind it. They don't care about the disruption. They care about Nancy. They just want her to come home, whatever it takes. Whoever has to visit. However many flowers get left at a door that no one opens anymore. Others in the community are less patient. The HOA's frustration is documented, notices sent, boundaries drawn, rules enforced. And that friction between compassion and inconvenience, between wanting justice and wanting your neighborhood back, mirrors the larger tension of this entire case. Everyone wants resolution. Nobody agrees on what the path to resolution looks like, and nobody has the authority to make the attention stop. Because public fascination doesn't answer to a homeowners association. And while the neighborhood debates flowers and foot traffic, somewhere, in a federal building, in a task force meeting room, on an analyst's screen, the actual investigation continues. The house waits, the family waits, and the silence stretches. 100 days. More than 100 days since Nancy Guthrie was in her home. The task force meets. The FBI handles family communication. The sheriff step back. Agents cycle in and out. Fresh eyes scan old reports. And somewhere, in a federal building, someone is looking at the same evidence for the 100th time, hoping to see what they missed the first 99. Nobody is saying anything. Not because there's nothing to say. Because in federal investigations, silence is a tool. Patience is a weapon. And the distance between we have nothing and we're not ready to show our hand is invisible to everyone standing on the outside looking in. The theories the public keeps reaching for don't hold. Scams leave digital fingerprints. Financial attacks leave trails that 3.5 months would have uncovered. Whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie doesn't fit into a comfortable category. It doesn't match a headline from California. It doesn't resolve into something neat or distant or random. It's closer than that, and it's darker than that. If you know anything at all, call 1-800-CALL-FBI. You can remain anonymous. The investigation is active. The task force is working full-time, and your information could be the piece that changes everything. Her daughter goes to work every morning on national television and holds herself together until she can't. Her neighbors leave flowers that the HOA wants removed. Her garden grows without her. Her pool sits still, and the house waits. Maintained, beautiful, empty. With at the front door, that someone should have collected a long time ago. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for more than 100 days. The people looking for her are exhausted and determined and holding on. The people who love her are grieving and fighting and refusing to let the world move on. And the silence of this investigation is either the worst possible sign or the best one. We don't know which, not yet. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because when this case breaks, and it will break, you need to be here. Nancy, wherever you are, we're still looking.